On Friday, 4th August 2017, in the early hours of the morning, police surveillance focused on a warehouse in Salford. From the outside, it looked routine, furniture stacked inside, nothing to suggest what was hidden there. 9 months later, in the early hours of the 5th of May 2018, another scene was unfolding in Hackney. Cars were parked along Alvington Crescent, inside men waiting for something darker. What started as a brief exchange on the street was about to erupt into sudden violence. 2 different moments, 2 different places, yet both would expose the scale of organized Turkish gangs operating inside the UK. This is the story of how a pizza shop owner built one of Britain's biggest heroin smuggling networks, and how a violent street crew left strangers scarred in a single night of brutality. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the details. In 1997, Frankfurt police made a familiar arrest. A man with a heavy moustache, short in stature but known across trafficking routes, was caught moving heroin from Turkey into Germany. His name was Fikri Yarasir. The courts handed him a 10-year sentence, and when that was served, Germany barred him from ever setting foot in the country again. Most men would have seen that as an ending. For Yarasir, it was a pause. By the time he left prison, heroin networks stretching from Istanbul into Europe were still alive, and he knew how to use them. His solution was simple. He crossed into the UK and chose somewhere few would look twice: the market town of Glossop in Derbyshire. There, he blended in. On the high street, he opened Yummies, a pizza and kebab shop serving locals and passing trade. To anyone walking through the door, he was just another migrant business owner making a modest living. In official records, his income was barely £12,000 a year. But behind the shop front, Yarasir was rebuilding. The moustache earned him a nickname among those who knew him, Mario, after the video game character he resembled. Quiet, calculated, and already hardened by prison time, he was laying the groundwork for something far larger than takeaway food. The foundations of one of Britain's biggest importation plots had been set. And soon, the pieces around him, employees, drivers, and couriers, would become part of the network he built. Fikri Yarasir didn't move drugs alone. To keep his operation alive, he built a circle of trusted players, each given a role, each a cog in the machinery that kept heroin flowing from Turkey into Britain. Closest to him was Ahmet Taskin, an employee at Yummies. On paper, just a takeaway worker. In reality, the man who helped shift shipments from lorries into warehouses, hiding tons of heroin behind stacks of wooden furniture. His position gave him access to both the front of the shop and the hidden world behind it. In Scotland, Yarasir relied on Brian Kennedy. He gave the smuggling a veneer of legitimacy by creating a company called Freight Forward Limited, and that was the key to this operation. On documents, it looked like a transport business. In reality, there was only one client and one purpose: to channel heroin from Turkey into Britain under the guise of legitimate imports. For the financial side, Yarasir turned to a couple from Manchester. Paul Livesey and Catherine Farron flew back and forth to Turkey. Their luggage told the story. We will talk about this in a few minutes. Together, they acted as couriers, shuttling Yarasir's money out of Britain and keeping the supply line open. On the ground in Wales, Stephen Hindley played his part. He rented a lock-up in Rhyl, transforming it into a bash house. Inside was equipment to dilute and press heroin, hydraulic machinery designed to stretch the drugs further for street sale. His lock-up was where purity turned into profit. And then there was David Mulligan. He was seen in cash deals that secured the equipment, including a forklift truck used to handle the heavy furniture concealing heroin. His role was to keep the operation supplied and the storage sites functional. Each of them held a piece of the puzzle. Together, they were the network that kept Yarasir's empire moving, a group that looked ordinary on the surface, but in reality formed the backbone of one of Britain's most ambitious heroin plots. It was a structure designed to look ordinary, but the scale was anything but. For months, Yaris's group kept their system running quietly. Yet organized crime of this size rarely goes unnoticed. By late 2016, officers in Greater Manchester had begun to pick up threads of unusual activity. Surveillance teams observed cash deals that didn't add up, one of them involving a forklift truck, a strange purchase for men who claimed to be moving furniture. Meetings between known figures and unexplained financial transfers only deepened the suspicion. The operation now had a name inside police files: Operation Cartoon. Slowly, investigators began connecting the dots between a modest takeaway in Glossop, a warehouse in Salford, and a series of movements pointing to something far more serious than food delivery. What began as whispers of unusual behavior was about to grow into one of the largest heroin smuggling investigations in UK history. It wasn't an instant raid. This was long surveillance, designed to watch and record, to follow money and movements until the picture was complete. Detectives tracked the men Yarasir had gathered around him. Each detail on its own could be explained away, but as the months passed, the threads began to form a clear pattern. The focus stayed on Yarasir. Surveillance teams followed him on runs across the north of England, shadowing his movements between Glossop, Salford, and Wales. They watched meetings with Kennedy, the so-called logistics man. In August 2017, the investigation reached its peak. Surveillance teams had tracked the lorry with its Turkish registration, followed it from Dover to Salford, and watched as Yarasir and Taskin unloaded the cargo into a warehouse on Cobden Street. When the opportunity came, officers moved in. Inside, the unit looked like a storage space filled with furniture. Dozens of wooden tables were stacked in a side room, cellophane still wrapped around them. At first glance, nothing unusual. But when detectives broke one apart, the truth was revealed. Each table contained a concealed compartment between the top and the underside. Hidden inside were packages, 10 blocks in every piece. Each block weighed half a kilo. By the time all 42 tables had been opened, the full scale was clear: 210 kilograms of heroin. At street level, it was worth £63 million. The purity was exceptional. Once cut and pressed, the drugs could have been stretched into far greater quantities, destined for towns and cities across the north of England. What had looked like ordinary furniture was, in reality, one of the largest consignments of heroin ever discovered by Greater Manchester Police. On the same day, a second team struck in Rhyl, North Wales. At a lockup rented by Stephen Hindley, they found hydraulic presses and moulds, the tools used to dilute and repackage heroin before it hit the streets. It was the final link in the chain, the place where imported purity was turned into street-level supply. The raids had delivered a devastating blow. What lay behind the false front of a kebab shop, a transport company, and a handful of rented spaces had been exposed in a single day. As we discussed earlier, for Greater Manchester Police, it was not just a major seizure. It was the largest heroin recovery in their history. Drugs told only half the story. To make the case stick, detectives needed to follow the money. That trail began with Paul Livesey and Catherine Fearon. On paper, they were a couple from Manchester making trips abroad. In reality, they were moving Yarasir's profits out of the country. Flights to Turkey became routine. Each time, their luggage went out full and returned almost empty. Investigators later discovered the missing weight was hundreds of thousands of pounds in cash. Across multiple journeys, the pair had carried an estimated £372,500 on behalf of the network, funneling drug money directly back to suppliers overseas. Financial investigators widened their scope. They looked at Freight Forward Limited. Large payments were traced through linked bank accounts, confirming the business had no real customers and existed purely as a front for smuggling for Yarasir. Then came the biggest discovery. For years, Yarasir had declared earnings of just £12,000 to £13,000 a year, barely enough to keep a takeaway afloat. Yet in Turkey, prosecutors found his name tied to the purchase of a factory worth close to £1 million. The gap between what he claimed and what he controlled was proof of an empire far larger than his kebab shop suggested. Every transfer, every flight, every account added to the case. What started as whispers of unusual behavior had become clear evidence of high-level criminal activity. Yarasir wasn't a small-time trader. He was the hub of a multi-million-pound pipeline, one built on secrecy, false fronts, and cash moved under the radar. With the financial web exposed and the heroin already identified in hidden shipments, investigators had what they needed. The moment to act had arrived. Officers moved to take down the network. The arrests were carried out in a series of coordinated strikes across the country. In Glossop, the man known as Mario was taken from his kebab and pizza outlet. Elsewhere, his closest associate Ahmet Taskin was also picked up. In Scotland, detectives arrested Brian Kennedy, the so-called logistics man. Back in Manchester, Paul Livesey and Catherine Fayeron were detained. In North Wales, Stephen Hindley was captured. Alongside him, David Mulligan, linked to cash handovers and equipment deals, was also taken into custody. The case against them was comprehensive. Fingerprints left on packages, surveillance logs of meetings and handovers, financial records connecting accounts to Yarasir. Piece by piece, the evidence left little room for denial. By the time the raids ended, the full structure of Yarasir's empire had collapsed. What had started with quiet surveillance in 2016 now stood ready for the courts. In April 2018, at Manchester Crown Court, the case of Fikri Yarasir and his network was laid bare. The trial stretched over 7 weeks, pulling together the months of surveillance, the financial evidence, and the record-breaking heroin seizure. Yarasir tried to distance himself from the plot. He claimed his involvement had been a cover, that he was gathering intelligence on his co-accused in order to act as a police informant. Detectives dismissed the story outright. Officers confirmed he had never once provided information, and the jury saw the claim for what it was, an attempt to escape responsibility. The evidence that we have already covered was overwhelming. Together, it painted a picture of a highly organized network. Yarasir and his associates were convicted of conspiracy to import and supply Class A drugs. The sentences reflected the scale of the crime. Fikri Yarasir, 53, received 25 years. Judge Martin Walsh told the court he had played a leading role, controlling supply lines and directing others. Brian Kennedy was jailed for 18 years. Paul Livesey was sentenced to 15 years, while his partner, Catherine Fayeron, received 9 years. Ahmet Taskin was handed 13.5 years. Stephen Hindley received 15 years, and David Mulligan was jailed for 17 years. The court heard that Yarasir was not acting alone. Judge Walsh noted that others, at a high level, remained undetected. But for those in the dock, the result was clear. More than 110 years of prison sentences handed down in total. It was the early hours of Saturday, 5th May 2018. Just after 5 a.m., Hackney's Alvington Crescent was still and dark, except for a row of cars parked along the street. Inside those cars sat 9 young men. Some smoked, others scrolled their phones. They weren't there by accident. They were waiting, and the atmosphere carried an edge. A passerby, a man never traced by police, walked past and exchanged words with Onur Ardik, one of the group members. The exchange was brief, but the reaction was immediate. Within seconds, the quiet street shifted into violence. The man was suddenly surrounded. Mustafa Kiziltan, one of the members, threw the first punch, and what followed was a swarm of fists and boots, 9 against 1. The victim was dragged to the ground, curled up and covering his head as the group kicked and stamped on him. The noise carried through the street, and people leaving a nearby club heard the commotion. Some moved towards the attack, trying to intervene. Among them was a young man in his 20s, who did what many instinctively do today. He raised his phone to record. The gang noticed. Within moments, the focus of their violence shifted. The man with the phone was targeted, dragged down, and kicked as they tried to rip the device from him. His friends tried to step in, but the fight was already spilling into a mass brawl. Two groups clashed in the middle of the crescent, the gang of 9 against the group of strangers who had tried to protect one man. In the chaos, Hussein Onel slipped away to one of the parked cars. When he re-emerged, he wasn't carrying fists. He held a small white bottle. Calmly, he stepped back into the melee. Then came the escalation that turned a beating into something far darker. Onel squeezed the bottle and sprayed. A noxious liquid hit faces at close range. Victims clutched their eyes, screamed, and staggered back. Those who tried to run were chased, Onel following with the bottle, spraying again and again. The acid struck several people. The man who had filmed the attack suffered the worst. Already beaten and on the ground, he was left with a fractured eye socket and corrosive burns across his eye. Doctors feared he would lose his sight. Later, they described his recovery as miraculous. Others were hit too. One victim suffered burns to his tongue. Another felt the liquid sear across his face as he tried to escape. Witnesses later told police how Onel was calm and deliberate, not lashing out in panic but targeting each person who came within reach. Panic broke across the street. People screamed. Some fled into side roads. Others stumbled half-blinded, their clothes burning where the liquid had splashed. For a moment, Alvington Crescent was chaos. A mix of violence, acid, and the fear of those trying to escape it. And yet, even as the victims fled, Onel continued. Step by step, he followed, raising the bottle and spraying at those who turned to run. It was methodical, as if the attack had shifted from a fight into a hunt. When it was over, the damage was clear. The first man, the passerby who had sparked the confrontation, was gone, never traced, never identified. But those who stepped in to help him were left scarred, some permanently. As quickly as the violence had started, it ended. The 9 men broke from the scene, leaving victims on the ground and others fleeing in shock. They piled back into 3 cars parked along Alvington Crescent. Doors slammed, and within moments the vehicles were pulling away from the street. From the open windows, shouts rang out. The gang hurled homophobic abuse at those left behind, mocking and taunting as they sped off into the city. Then came the boast, shouted as if the attack was proof of control, and claimed as they ran Hackney. In the minutes after the Hackney attack, emergency calls flooded in. Police units and paramedics were dispatched, arriving to find victims with serious injuries and a street scattered with chaos. The attackers were gone, but within hours officers had secured the area, collected statements, and begun gathering the evidence that would unravel the case. CCTV cameras, mounted on nearby buildings, recorded the assault from beginning to end. Every stage of the brawl, every movement in the street, and most importantly, the moment the white bottle was raised and corrosive liquid was sprayed into faces, was preserved in clear detail. Detectives later said the footage was crucial. It gave them not just a timeline, but an irrefutable visual record of who had been there and what each had done. Investigators from the Metropolitan Police quickly secured the recordings. Frame by frame, the officers worked through the evidence. The images provided a map of the night. Who threw the first punch, who joined the kicks and blows, and who carried the bottle of acid. Later, we will discuss each individual's role in that show of violence and brutality, but video alone was not enough. The investigation widened. Crime scene examiners recovered the discarded bottle used to hold the noxious substance. It was sent for forensic testing, and the Met's Fingerprint Bureau confirmed what the cameras already suggested. The attackers had left their marks not only on their victims, but on the evidence itself. The prints placed men like Hussein Onel directly in contact with the weapon. With fingerprints, CCTV, and multiple victim statements, detectives were now able to identify the majority of the suspects. One by one, names were matched to faces. Onel, Tekagaç, Ardik, the Kizilton brothers, and the rest of the group. The process was not immediate. Tracking down 9 men spread across Hackney and beyond required patience. Over 4 months, teams of officers worked systematically, conducting arrests, questioning suspects, and piecing together the chain of responsibility. The investigation was led by Detective Constable David Leitner of the Central East Command Unit. When the men were finally charged, he described what had been uncovered. The investigation would later confirm the first man, the passerby who had argued with Onur Ardik, was the original target of the group. His name never appeared in court, his part in the night still a mystery. On Thursday, 17th January 2019, at Wood Green Crown Court, the case of the Hackney Acid Gang was brought to a close. Over 7 weeks, the jury had been shown all the evidence that we have already discussed. The central figure, Hüseyin Onel, 24, he was sentenced to 17 years in prison with an additional 3 years on extended license. Mehmet Tekagaç, 30, was heavily involved in the violence as well. CCTV showed him among the attackers who set upon the man filming, ripping away his phone as he lay on the ground. He was sentenced to 14.5 years in prison, plus 3 years on extended license. Onur Ardik, 27, he too was found guilty of applying a corrosive substance with intent, receiving 14 years in prison, plus 3 years on extended license. Mustafa Kiziltan, 30, was also convicted of dangerous driving when he fled the scene. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, including 27 months for violent disorder, 9 months for dangerous driving, and an additional 3 months for failing to stop, all running concurrently. Serkan Kiziltan, 22, was part of the group who joined the attack as it escalated, kicking and punching victims on the ground. For his role, he received 18 months in prison for violent disorder. Güven Ulas, 20, had also joined in the violence, contributing to the brawl that left multiple people seriously injured. He was sentenced to 30 months in prison for violent disorder. Umit Kaygisiz, 21, not only took part in the violent disorder, but later attempted to smuggle a mobile phone into prison. For both offences, he was sentenced to a total of 28 months in prison. Yasam Erdogan, 24, was present during the assault and convicted of violent disorder. He received an 18-month suspended sentence. Turgut Adakan, 23, was also convicted of violent disorder and, like Erdogan, was handed an 18-month suspended sentence. In total, 9 men were sentenced, and the combined prison terms stretched to nearly 60 years. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK Crime Documentaries.